Hi, everyone, and welcome to Reimagine Agriculture, the podcast where we explore the future of farming, food, and rural life across Europe through the eyes of the people shaping it. I'm Teresa Carvalho, and in this series, we'll meet people from across Europe who are reshaping the future of agriculture. Today, we're joined by Manon Scotts, project lead at the Protein Project. Hi, Manon.
Hello.
So, for listeners who might not be familiar with the Protein Project, could you explain a bit more about its mission and how it came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Protein Project was founded in May, co-founded by Katrien Martens and Marin van Damme. So they both met during the fellowship that they did at the School for Moral Ambition, where they worked specifically on the EU agri-food system with a focus on policy. And after their fellowship ended, they decided they wanted to keep working on the EU food system. And during their fellowship, they also realized that there were a lot of really great NGOs already doing amazing work on the food system, but there was a need for an actor that worked specifically on depolarizing the food system because they noticed the very strong polarization around all the food topics and more specifically protein. So they decided together to found the Protein Project to work exactly on that, so depolarizing the food system with a lens on EU policy.
Perfect. It's really impressive how you have come into the space with a very clear system level ambition, especially by trying to create common ground in what's often a very fragmented conversation. And it's also a debate that has evolved fast in recent years with increasing attention from policymakers as they consider how the CAP can support more resilient and diversified farming systems. Protein diversification is a term that we hear more and more, but in practical terms, what does it mean?
Well, it's literally diversifying the protein that we eat, right? So there's different sources of protein. There's animal protein, plant protein, but also novel. So everything around fermentation technologies and cultivation. It's a very important element of our diet. So we need to eat protein, of course. But in the recent years and decades, we have been eating a lot more of the animal sourced ones. If you look at the diets of our grandparents around the 1960s, there was about 60% plant based and 40% animal based protein. And that has shifted around completely today with the 40% plant only and 60% animal. So it has, had the tendency to increase over the past decades. And what we want to do with protein diversification is to revert that a little bit to diversify even more and have a more balanced intake of protein in our diets.
So it's really about diversity in crops, protein sources, and value chains rather than promoting or prescribing one ideal diet or production model. And this brings us to the way protein is often framed in public debates. It's sometimes framed as a binary debate, plant versus animal. And why is this debate so polarized today? And how does the Protein Project approach this diversification differently?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements of why it's so polarized today, and I don't think we'll manage to cover all of that in depth in this conversation today. But maybe very high level, food is a topic that we're all very close to. I mean, we eat 3 times a day, so it's a topic that feels very personal and that most of us also identify ourselves with quite strongly. So, of course, when someone touches upon the way we eat, or at least that's the way it's perceived, it can get quite personal quite quickly. There's also a lot of different elements that food touches upon and different hot topics as well. So there is the environmental angle, there is the farmer position, there is the use of genetic techniques in foods, but there's also our health. And health is, of course, also something that's very personal and that feels like it shouldn't be left in the hands of other people. So that's why it feels quite personal and is also the source of quite a lot of polarization. There's also some actors that are actually benefiting from the way that the system is currently shaped and don't really have an interest in seeing this status quo evolving. So that also keeps a bit fueling this polarization.
So, this clearly shows the importance of moving beyond an either or thinking and instead looking for solutions that can support multiple goals at once, whether that's to farm livelihood, sustainability, or competitiveness. But looking at the bigger picture, from your perspective, what role can protein diversification play in addressing challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, farm resilience, and strategic autonomy in Europe?
Yeah, very strong role in my opinion, and that's exactly why we work on the protein diversification. Strategic autonomy is something that is on everyone's lips today, and it's becoming a very top of mind on the political agenda as well. And it's actually very much linked to the report that we published yesterday on food security called From Dependency to Diversity. and it focuses specifically on the soy import dependencies and looks at different strategies of how to improve the EU's strategic autonomy. On the one hand, on producing more protein crops in Europe to have to import less of them. About 90% of the soy that is currently used in Europe is imported. So we are very reliant on other countries for this, and it's at the basis of a lot of our livestock system today. But also looking at circularity, how can we improve the circularity of our system to also be less dependent on soy and feed imports, producing more innovative protein in Europe, and then of course also changing a bit the consumption patterns in the European diets towards more diversification. So again, we bring back this balance between animal, plants, and novel protein. And all of these strategies are actually play a role in getting us to this more resilience in the EU, but also bring a lot of opportunities for farmers. Going back on the protein crops cultivation, well, a lot of farmers that we have engaged with through our work on legumes, through the Legume Renaissance report that we published in February, see the huge benefits in producing more protein crops in their rotations, agronomic benefits through the nitrogen fertilization that the legume crops bring, which reduces the need for chemical fertilizers, but they can also use these their harvest as feed for their animals on the farm, so they're also less reliant and dependent on the very volatile market of feed imports. So there's really benefits all around that's are very much interlinked as well.
So, protein diversification often comes up in environmental discussions, but what you're highlighting is that it's also closely linked to economic resilience and Europe's reliance on important protein. These are increasingly important considerations for European agricultural policy, including discussions around the CAP. Importantly, though, these ideas also need to work in practice. Can you share some concrete examples of some successful initiatives or projects that are already advancing protein diversification on the ground?
Yeah, the example that I wanted to share here is actually related to the fermentation topic, and it's a project that my colleague has been leading for the past few months. And she brought together different NGOs, environmental NGOs, climate, health as well, civil society, so consumer groups. And the purpose of this NGO was to create a common understanding around fermentation, which is today very polarized, but also a huge black box for a lot of people and a lot of NGOs that don't really know how to position themselves because they don't really understand what's behind this big word of fermentation. So she created a forum with different sessions to which she invited academia players, but also the private sector to come and explain a bit their work and bring some more understanding on different topics. So it covered health, environmental potential, but also the use of genetic techniques, opportunities for farmers, and so forth. So really addressing key topics that are usually at the base of this polarization. That's really helped to get all of these NGOs at least on the same page of understanding to, in the future, if they wish to do so, be able to position themselves in one way or the other around this topic, but also knowing why they do so.
Okay, so of course, farmers are central to this transition. And how do farmers experience the shift towards more diverse protein in our diets, and what kind of opportunities or challenges does this create for them?
Well, farmers respond to market signals. I mean, they need offtake, so they of course need to adapt their activities based on what the market wants. And a lot of the farmers that we've engaged with, both on our work on legumes, but also on fermentation, and now on the livestock sector recently, a lot of them are already treating this as an opportunity and shifting their practices to respond to this needs of or to this demand for protein diversification. Maybe to share an example, so a farm that we visited in the Netherlands called the Nieuwe Melkboer, so it's the new milk farm in English. They used to have dairy cows, quite a lot of dairy cows, and then they took over the farm from their parents, two brothers, and they decided to slowly shift away from dairy because it didn't really fit with what or the way that they wanted to farm, and they started producing soy to make soy milk and then afterwards soy yogurt. So they invested in infrastructure on their farm to do this big fermentation tanks and so forth, and to really completely shift their practices and their activities because they also saw the market for this soy milk that was not really tapped into, I would say, from their in their local context, and they wanted to have a role there. So they really looked at a market gap, a demand that they saw as likely to strengthen in the next years and wanted to take that opportunity for themselves.
What I really see from this is that diversification has to make sense economically and practically for farmers. Otherwise, it simply won't be viable for them to adopt. And this is where the EU's common agricultural policy becomes particularly important. How is the CAP projected to support protein diversification, for example, through eco schemes, crop diversification measures, or rural development funding?
So, as you probably know, there's the new cap that will come into action after 2027 or as of 2027. And the proposition from the Commission has already been received. It's not finalized yet, but there's quite some measures in the new proposition of the CAP and also of the Common Market Organization, the CMO, that are quite encouraging and would really enable quite some support for protein crops, but also diversification on the farm. To give you a few examples, in the CMO, there's a proposition to make protein crops a standalone sector, which would be a great benefit because that would unlock then the creation of producer organizations and more cooperatives around protein crops, something that is currently very much missing in a lot of member states. There's very few producer organizations focusing on legumes only, whereas being organized in such a way really helps farmers to strengthen their business case, strengthen their bargaining power and their position within the value chain. So this creation of the protein crop sector is very welcomed. There's also, of course, this new type of measure called the agri-environmental and climate action, which is to provide transition support for farmers who want to invest in more sustainable practices on their farm. And we see that as quite a big opportunity for protein crops and farmers who want to start cultivating these crops and need the support to make this transition. Because, of course, as you integrate a new crop in your rotation, it always leads to a risk and usually a fall in revenue for the first period while you're still getting accustomed to growing that crop and getting the necessary expertise. But also growing protein crops is an opportunity for farmers to do some of the processing of these crops on their farms, like dehulling, the milling, to sell their products with a higher value to the next actor in the value chain. But that needs investments, which costs money. So bringing investment support through the pathway of these agri-environmental climate action could be a great opportunity. And then lastly, of course, the coupled income support. So that remains also an important lever to make the business case stronger for farmers. And there is a possibility in the next cap to have coupled income supports for protein crops. But even if it's in the cap, it's still up to the member states to add that into their national strategic plans. So that still remains to be seen to what extent it's used across the regions.
So, there are CAP tools that support protein diversification under both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, but their effectiveness depends on how member states design and implement their national CAP strategic plans. And while these tools do exist, it is also clear that more can be done to encourage farmers to diversify while also considering the wider impact across the food system. The Protein Project focuses on building consensus across divides. How could CAP design better reflect this through solutions that work for farmers, for the environment, and food system competitiveness?
So, supporting farmers to diversify their activities in a way that makes sense for them, I think, is a very strong one. So, there's no silver bullets on exactly how the cap should be designed to be perfect, I would say. But there are definitely some actions that could help to really reflect the complexity of the food system and provide this flexibility for farmers to do what makes sense for them. So that could be growing more protein crops, but that could also be extensifying the way that they hold their livestock, or it could be transitioning to higher welfare systems for them through investments in higher welfare housing or using more circular feed on their farm to reduce their footprint and increase their circularity and their ecosystem. So there's very different measures, and it's would again take a very long time to go through all of them. But I think a cap that reflects the system and that enables farmers to move away from the highly industrialized system that many of the farms are still under today towards practices that make more sense for them, also socially and economically, because a lot of farmers are still very much under economical pressure today.
That's a really important point and shows how aligning CAP incentives with real system wide outcomes, not just individual measures, is crucial. It also speaks to the need for coherence across policy areas from agriculture to trade to food policy, rather than treating them in silos. Beyond direct farmer support, how important is EU level support for research, innovation, and value chain development for protein crops in making protein diversification economically viable and
Well,
scalable?
in our opinion, that's very important. And that's exactly the approach that we also take in our project. So we believe very strongly that it's important to have a value chain approach and to address the challenges in the value chain holistically, not in the silos that you usually are stuck in. So that's exactly what we try to identify in our Legume Renaissance roadmap. So looking at the different challenges across the chain, and that we now also aim to look into more closely in our next project on what are the different investments that need to happen across the chain and how can we tackle them in parallel, because it's of course important to look at both production and consumption simultaneously, because it's great to have a lot of production and a production system that works well, but if there's no demand for it, it's never going to grow and scale the way that we want it to be. So looking, for example, at farmers, they often say, great, I have varieties that work, but I don't have always the yields that I would want to have, or they don't meet specific requirements of the processing industry because they have, I don't know, too many anti-nutritional factors that makes it unsuitable for processing as a food ingredient. So they need varieties that are better adapted for that. But the breeding companies don't really have the interest and incentive to invest in breeding programs because the demand is so low for seeds on the market. So it's kind of this vicious circle. And again, of course, if producers don't have the right varieties to work with, they can't expand their activities and the demand is also not going to grow on the market. And that's really the vicious circle that is keeping the protein crops still minor in the EU today. And that's why we think that tackling all of these challenges at the same time is crucial.
So it sounds like consistency and support across sectors is key here, from research and innovation to processing, and from stable markets to consumer demand. That's especially important when we think about the next generation entering the sector. How can protein diversification be framed as an opportunity rather than a constraint for younger farmers and food entrepreneurs entering the agri food sector?
We very much look at protein diversification as a way for farmers to also be flexible and be more diversified in their own activities on the farm, which next to really bringing more resilience to their economic case as farmers, also often allows them to be more in line with the activities that or the practices that they have. For example, you could have a livestock farmer who has an extensive livestock system, which is highly beneficial for their own well-being because they see their animals roaming free and being kept in a way that is natural for them. But next to that, could also have a restaurant or a shop on their farm, welcoming tourists in area to pass by, or having closer link with the local communities who come in and buy their local products from their farm. So there's really a lot of advantages to diversification. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, so there's this kind of market demand now for products that are higher welfare, that are locally grown, that have a lesser environmental footprint. So farmers who tap into that also will directly often unlock premiums that reflect this need, which allows them then to continue their activities and to invest in that way. There is still quite some work that needs to be done for these premiums to really be unlocked for farmers, like higher transparency on shelves, a better labeling system to really recognize that, and for the consumers to be able to make that mindful decision when they buy in the stores. But there is a lot of opportunity for that.
That's a refreshing perspective, and the idea of seeing diversification not as an obligation, but as a space for innovation and new business models. It really highlights how this transition can open up doors for creativity in farming, food production, or even entirely new value chains. Looking ahead, what gives you hope when you think about the future of protein diversification in Europe? And what one policy or system level shift would make the biggest difference in accelerating the transition?
Well, looking back on the year and a bit that we've been existing as a protein project, it's quite amazing to see how many actors and experts and farmers and policymakers we have been engaging with. People have given their time to share their expertise, to be involved and very active in the work that we've been doing. So there's a clear interest from the full value chain to make protein diversification happen and make that a reality. So that's, of course, very encouraging, and we very much look forward to continuing to work with all of these actors and deep diving on other topics, further on the topics that we have already been exploring. So, yeah, very energizing. On the policy, as you may know, there's the EU protein plan that will soon be published by the European Commission. It's due to be published on July 7th, so coming up very soon. And there has been a leak of this draft over the past weeks that has been also very positive surprise for us. It's addresses really consumption and production in parallel and recognizes the need to take this value chain approach that I mentioned earlier, we find very important. It also very supportive of the different recommendations that we have on our legume renaissance roadmap. So the policy recommendations we gave on how to make the sector more viable and to scale it. So that's of course very positive to see as well. And it sees different types of protein, so novel protein, plant protein, animal protein, as complementary and not as opposing one another, which is also great to see. Very curious on how this will all be implemented and acted upon, because it's currently still quite vague on the different financing structures on how to scale that. But I think that will be the work of the next few months and years. So it's very exciting policy.
It's encouraging to hear that there's both momentum and a clear sense of direction. And at the same time, it sounds like unlocking that potential will really depend on coordinated action across policy, markets, the wider food system to turn these opportunities into reality. Thank you so much, Manon, for joining us today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Reimagine Agriculture, part of the Recap Project, where we bring forward the voices helping to shape a more sustainable, inclusive, and community driven future for European farming. See you in the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.